is 1995, and the gentleman is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Ward, who has been sentenced to death for killing his mother-in-law. And for those that are wondering, it is illegal still. And standing next to Thomas Ward on this particular occasion is a rookie warden by the name of Burl Cain. The prison is Angola Prison in Louisiana. And Angola Prison was known to be the roughest prison in the Americas system. Basically, it housed the hardest criminals in America. When you were checked into Angola Prison, you were checked in with a set of pajamas, so to speak, and a dagger to protect yourself. They'd given up. Along comes Burl Cain, and then Thomas Ward is sentenced to death, and he's there to do what he has to do, which is to oversee the execution. And only in the job for 3 months, he realises one important thing, that this man has just slipped into eternity, and he has not addressed the condition of the man's soul. Today, Angola Prison still houses 5,000 inmates, but there is a difference in Angola Prison. And Burl Cain went to the state authorities and he said, I'm going to do jail differently from now on. And the first simple difference he decided he was going to make, I'm going to put a Bible in the hands of every inmate. So he filled every cell with a Bible. He made that available. He made available the opportunity for those that wanted to study the Bible to come into Bible study classes. Now there are many Bible study classes crammed with over 100 people cramming into cells to study the Bible. We now have missionaries being sent out of this prison to other prisons. 2 by 2, these guys are being sent out. And in 1 year alone, there was 150 baptisms and over 15,000 evangelical contacts in the prison system because of what is happening in Angola Prison. Friends, Burl Cain is living differently and he is making a difference. And if I had a title for this morning's message, it would be Living Differently and Making a Difference. Burl Cain decided he was going to do things differently, and there was a tremendous change. We now have people like John Piper and other people that go and teach at Angola. These inmates receive absolutely no concessions for what they do. They receive no reduction in their sentences. They receive no more perks. They just want to take the gospel of Christ to other inmates. One inmate says that no one looks at their watch during sermon time because all we have is time. So no looking at your watches this morning. Another one says, and I think this is a remarkable statement for a hardened criminal to make. Another inmate says that Jesus is in this place and hearts are changing. What a profound statement for an inmate to make. To stand there and say that Jesus is in this place and hearts are changing. I look forward to the day that people will stand in the Redlands and say, Jesus is in this place and people's hearts are changing. And I believe it's possible. And biblically speaking, we're going to look at a guy that lived differently and made a difference. For those of you who don't know, Daniel was taken into exile under the regime of Babylon. And Daniel's best estimates are Daniel was 16 or 17 years of age when he was taken into exile. Babylon, at that time run by Nebuchadnezzar, was a ruthless, tyrannical empire that would absolutely ransack countries. And that's exactly what they did. They tried to diplomatically have relations with Jerusalem. They fell down, and we read in Jeremiah how that happens and how that comes to pass. And then Babylon comes in and ransacks Jerusalem and takes its finest men. This was something that Babylon did systematically. They would take your youngest, best-looking, wisest, most educated guys, and they would take them into the service. So here's a guy of 16, 17 years of age, taken to Babylon, away from his parents, away from his home, away from everything that he knows and what is familiar to him, and he makes a decision while he is there. It is a decision, as we will see the results of this decision, that turns the most wicked empire upside down on its head and its leader. It's at this time that Daniel, who at his age, as young as he is placed under the charge of what they call the chief of eunuchs. And a eunuch in those days was basically a guy who had been castrated. And we understand that if you are put in charge by the chief of the eunuchs, that you are a eunuch. Daniel, we will see later on, will study the prophecies of Jeremiah to understand exactly how long that these guys will be in exile, and he understands that it's 70 years. It's 70 years exactly to the day these guys are taken into exile and then they are taken out. Daniel lives to see that day. He would be 85 to 86 years of age. It is possible that he could be as young as 12 or 13 and no older than about 18 or 19 when he's taken to Babylon. Imagine that for a moment, if you will. Imagine if you were Daniel, what would be running through your mind at this point in time? This is a guy that faithfully served God. He wasn't the one that was involved in all the wickedness that we see at Jerusalem at the time the judgment came on Jerusalem. He wasn't involved in that. We see that he's a guy that obviously is well educated and wise, and he would be standing in Babylon wondering what on earth is going on. C.H. Spurgeon said, we cannot always trace God's hand, but we can always trust his heart. And Daniel at this time could possibly look back and he may not be able to trace exactly what God is up to. Ever been in that position? Ever been standing in one place and thinking, God, what on earth are you up to? This doesn't look like you. But as Spurgeon says, we can always trust his heart. And I believe we can. Let's have a look at the Word of God this morning. Starting in chapter 1. We'll start at verse 4, and it says, Youths, speaking of Daniel and 3 of his mates, without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. So this is where they were assigned to, and to teach them the literature and language of Babylon. That's what they were charged to do with these young guys. Verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So here we see that Daniel's taken to Babylon. He's chosen to serve Nebuchadnezzar in the king's palace, and part of the perks of that is you get to eat the same food as Nebuchadnezzar. You get to drink the same wine as the king of Babylon. You get to enjoy these luxuries, even though you're in exile. And who here would not put their hand up and go, well, that's the least that I deserve? After everything that's happened to me, surely God is blessing me. But Daniel had a bit of a different idea. And if we come down to verse 8, we'll see, but Daniel resolved, which is a fantastic word. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. What's the problem? The problem is that the Babylonians would often sacrifice their food to idols and to gods and to everything that they had constructed as a god, and then they would sit down and have a big feast, and Daniel says, you know what, I can't do this. This is in complete opposite to what God commands me to do. And it is at this point in time that Daniel makes his intentions clear. And his intention is, I don't care where you put me, I don't care what my circumstances are telling me, I will worship God. I'll worship God and I will honour God. Not an easy choice. Not an easy choice. So living differently, first and foremost, looks like we resolve not to be defiled. We resolve to live our lives completely undefiled. And here's an amazing fact, in Babylon, all you had to do to be swept away into the evil of that time was to stand still. All you had to do was to make a choice. I'm just going to go with the flow. Daniel makes a deliberate choice. I'm not going to go with the flow. I'm not going to stand still. I'm actually going to swim against the current. Do to me as you will. So Daniel makes an agreement with the chief of the eunuchs. And basically what Daniel says to the chief of the eunuchs is, he says, I can't do this. He says, so let's set up a test, and for 10 days I'll just eat vegetables. And I'm not advocating to become a vegetarian or a vegan this morning, by the way. Eat meat, please. New Testament people, eat meat. But Daniel says, you know what, I don't want to partake of any of that food, so you just give us vegetables. And if after 10 days there's any difference in our appearance, if there's any difference in our health, then you do what you have to do. Because the chief eunuch knew full well that if he presented these guys in 3 years and there was any deficiency, this was not only Daniel's life, this was his life. Life was cheap in Babylon. So Daniel makes an arrangement with him, and come with me, if you will, down to verse 15. And it says, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. And I love that verse, because that verse not only speaks of the triumph of God, but God actually makes a decision that in the most evil empire, I am going to miraculously and gloriously display who I am. Babylon didn't deserve this. Babylon doesn't deserve to have 4 guys standing in their empire willing to show forth the glory of God. And God says, I will display my mighty hand. None of us in this room deserve that either. None of us. But God makes a choice, both here for Daniel, for Babylon, and for us today. He makes a choice. I will display my mighty hand. I actually think and personally believe that the greatest miracle that God performs and continues to perform is salvation. I think salvation is a miracle, an absolute miracle, to change our heart of stone and to mould us and fashion us as he does. So we see that Daniel resolves that he is going to be different. He's not going to be polluted. God moves powerfully, and there is a testimony here, not only to the chief of eunuchs, but to everybody else that knows what's going on. There's a testimony here that the God that Daniel serves is the God of all power. Come with me, if you will, to chapter 3, and I'll just briefly let you know what transpires as we jump through the book of Daniel. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, he has a dream. So this is still something that God is poking at Nebuchadnezzar's heart. And Nebuchadnezzar has some dreams, and nobody can tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream. And Daniel, by the power of God, is able to tell him his dream. And then we come to chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's going to set up this huge golden statue in his own image for everybody to worship. Talk about pride and arrogance. Just on Nebuchadnezzar, read Isaiah 45, and you'll see you'll get a little bit of an insight on what God's doing here. You see, in Isaiah 45, God speaks through Isaiah to Nebuchadnezzar and says, Nebuchadnezzar, paraphrasing, you're a tool in my hand. God says to Nebuchadnezzar, I will bring judgment on my people, and I will use you to do it. Interesting who's in control. Nebuchadnezzar may not just be in control as much as he thinks he is. So let's have a look at what happens. Now we're going to have a look at 3 friends of Daniel, and we know that these guys are renamed. These guys are given a complete different identity, and names actually held huge significance in these days. But Daniel and his 3 mates, their names are changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we know the story of these guys, and we know the story of the fiery furnace, but let's have a look at what happens here. And Nebuchadnezzar sets up this golden statue. He decrees that everybody must worship it. And in verse 7 of chapter 3, it says, therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, and I've got no idea what half of these instruments are, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So everybody's doing this. Everybody's worshipping this. Come with me over to verse 13. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, because these guys have... Now, why is Nebuchadnezzar in a furious rage? These guys have refused, and everybody wants these guys out. So all the other people have come to Nebuchadnezzar and said, these Jews, they won't worship like you've told everybody to worship, and these guys are refusing. In fact, they're bowing down to their God. In spite of the decree that you have set up, they are bowing down to their God. And verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and he said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready So Nebuchadnezzar gives them another chance. So now if you already hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? What an arrogant statement to make. What an arrogant statement for Nebuchadnezzar to make. So these guys take a stand, and we see that God has already begun to graciously work in Babylon, and these guys say, we're not going to worship what you worship. But things look pretty grave for these guys, and whenever you take a stand for God, it's going to cost you something. It's going to make you unpopular, most likely, with the norm, and everybody else is just going along with this, and we'll just do what everybody else is doing, and we'll do what Nebuchadnezzar tells us that we should do, and these guys could even be excused for making excuses, and they're like, well, what good are we dead? And surely this isn't a big thing, and we didn't set up this image, so surely it's not a big deal if we worship this image. But it is a big deal. It's a big deal to these guys. It's a big deal to God. And Nebuchadnezzar lays it on the line. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered, and they said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. We're guilty as charged. We're not even going to attempt to justify ourselves. We're not going to beg for mercy from you. We're not going to change our resolve or change our mind. We're not going to answer you in this matter. Verse 17. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. What a declaration to make before the king. If it be so, our God is able. But I love the next verse. I love what they continue to say in verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. God is able, Nebuchadnezzar, to save us from the burning fiery furnace, and we're not going to step down. But you know what? If God doesn't save us, makes no difference. We're still not going to bow down. We're still not going to worship what you worship. We're still going to worship him. And here we see three guys abandoned to the grace of God. Here's three guys that stand before Nebuchadnezzar, and my paraphrase this morning is, these guys are saying to Nebuchadnezzar, you know what? We don't control God. We don't tell God what to do. There's no mathematical formula here so that we can conjure up some God to get him to do what we want to do when we want to do it. No. It's the other way around. We do his bidding. And if he wants to, he can save us from this. But if he chooses not to, we will stand and we will worship God. The second thing we see in the book of Daniel about living differently is living abandoned to the grace of God. Living abandoned to his will. Worshipping him despite our circumstances. There's people here today, I'm sure, that would gladly put their hand up and say, my circumstances aren't fantastic. The difference between joy and happiness is dependent on our circumstances. The wonderful, profound thing about joy is it is not dependent on our circumstances. Corrie Ten Boom, a lovely lady that suffered much, and she said, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. That's exactly what these guys are doing right now. They are not afraid to trust an unknown future. They don't know the outcome. They don't know what's going to happen. And the story goes on that these guys are placed in the furnace and Nebuchadnezzar ramps it up to mega hot. In fact, the people that throw these guys into the furnace are consumed. It's that hot. Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace from a distance and sees there's not three guys in there, there's four. And one that looks like the angel of God. God preserves these guys, and This is just a string of series of events where God decides that I'm going to display my glory amongst Babylon. God decides that I'm going to reveal my glorious, powerful hand to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, it turns out, is humbled. He's actually the only king in the Bible recorded that is converted. God humbles Nebuchadnezzar. God removes the pride of Nebuchadnezzar. And the Bible, the book of Daniel, if you read on, it will tell you that Nebuchadnezzar, God strikes him with insanity. And it speaks of the fact that he eats grass like the beasts of the field with the dew on his back. In other words, he's on all fours eating grass for something like 7 years. And God restores his reason. And Nebuchadnezzar says, when my reason returned, I understood. What's he understand? I'm not God. There is one so much greater than I am. I personally believe God wishes to display his power in our generation. Here's the profound thing. He chooses to do it through us. God decided he was going to display his power in Babylon, and he chose to do it through 4 guys. But he hasn't finished yet. If you'd like to turn over to chapter 6 of Daniel, we see that an amazing turn of events happens to Babylon. Babylon is a tremendously powerful empire that is also tremendously, obviously, naive and arrogant, because we will see that an empire as big as they are actually overthrown in one night, because unawares to them, the Medo-Persians have come in and completely diverted the Tigris, I believe it's the Tigris River, completely diverted it. You couldn't penetrate Babylon, like it was a fortified city, you couldn't get in. And the Medo-Persians completely divert this river and walk through a dry riverbed into Babylon and overthrow it in one night. And that's the story of Belshazzar, who sees the writing on the wall, and they ask for the meaning. And if there's ever writing on the wall, probably don't ask for the meaning, because Belshazzar regrets it. But anyway, Babylon is overthrown in one night. And the Medo-Persians take up reign, and we have a new king, a king of 62 years of age by the name of Darius, who's a Medo-Persian. And, you know, these guys are much the same. And Daniel is still in the same position. He's still in the king's court, and we'll see what happens to Daniel. And probably the most important thing is what we see in chapter 6 with the life of Daniel. Let's start at verse 4. Then the presidents and the satraps sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel. Verse 3 says, I'll just read it briefly. It says, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and all the other satraps. He becomes distinguished because of what? An excellent spirit. Something different about Daniel. There was an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Fast forward to today, and God has provided another excellent spirit to reside in each one of us. Verse 4, the presidents and the satraps sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel. Daniel is obviously clearly distinguished by his behaviour and by, as we see, an excellent spirit that resides in Daniel. And these presidents and satraps are just like magicians and wise men that Darius would seek counsel from. And these guys want to get rid of Daniel. They see that Daniel's better than them. They see that Daniel's wiser than them. They see that there is something in Daniel that they don't have because of the life that he lives. Interesting. And they want to get rid of Daniel. How many of us just, coincidentally, how many of us have skeletons in our closet that we wouldn't clamber to run and lock if people started looking at our lives? But that's exactly what happens here to Daniel. And come with me down to verse 10, if you will. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed. What's going on here with the document? These guys come to Darius, and in an attempt to get rid of Daniel, they say, listen, everybody should be worshipping you, and these guys aren't worshipping you, but everybody should be worshipping you. So you set up a decree, knowing full well that once this decree is set up, there's no going back for Darius. You set up a decree that if anybody worships anything or anyone apart from you, that they be done away with. And Darius says that's a good idea, and he signs the document. Daniel's no fool. Daniel knows what the signing of that document means. for him. Let's see what Daniel's response is. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Isn't it interesting how Daniel knows exactly what's going to happen, but he doesn't run to Darius and beg for mercy. He doesn't seek vengeance on the guys that have set him up. These guys have obviously set him up. These guys are obviously trying to get rid of him. He doesn't seek vengeance. He doesn't jump on a horse and bolt out of the city. Daniel does what he's always done. He goes and worships God. He goes and worships God. Jerry Bridges says that prayer is the most tangible expression of trusting God. And at the prayer meeting on Wednesday, I shared a quote from Corrie ten Boom, which asks each and every one of us, is prayer your spare tyre or your steering wheel? Is prayer that is something that is a part of our everyday life, or is it our spare tyre when we get into trouble? For Daniel, it was a part of his everyday life. The third thing that distinguishes us, the third thing that we begin to see in the life of Daniel is living differently means that we live to an audience of one. Daniel lived his life to the audience of one person, and that was God. The one that knows our every thought. The one that knows every word before it falls from our mouths. The Bible says that he holds every one of our tears in a bottle. And to this one, Daniel says, I live my life to him. Doesn't matter what other people think. Doesn't matter whether people are watching. But it has an effect on every part of Daniel's life because he realises in deep relationship with God, his life must look different. And we know the story, don't we? Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. Darius can't go back on his word, and Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, but he's preserved by the mighty hand of God. And I love verse 23 of chapter 6. Then the king was exceedingly glad, and King Darius is exceedingly glad because Daniel has been thrown into the lion's den, but no harm has come to him, and this makes him glad. And he commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den, so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him. Why? Because he trusted in his God. We have a huge challenge, I believe, and part of yesterday we unfolded at the Leaders Summit, we unfolded some of the stuff that I believe God's laid on my heart, that we will take the gospel, that we will take a light into a dark world. And that's exactly what Daniel and his 3 mates did here. You may not be thrown into a fiery furnace, but it may feel like it at times. But I believe each and every one of us is called to shine God's light wherever we are. Whether it's at school or work or whatever place it is, we are called to shine God's light. This morning as we come to a close, I would ask each one here, what is it perhaps that you need to resolve with inside of yourself? What resolve perhaps do we each individually need to make? What situations and circumstances are there perhaps in your life where you need to say, I need to abandon myself to the grace of God here? Isn't it amazing what God can do through 4 guys who stand and say, you know what, we're just empty vessels, God. We're just empty vessels. You come and do what you want to do through us. And last of all, where's our trust? I would challenge each and every one of us this morning. Where's our trust? And to what audience do we live today? Let's pray. Father, each one of us would sit in your presence and ask to be empty vessels. To be full of you, O God, we know that we must be empty of ourselves, and we ask that you would empty us of ourselves and fill us with your presence. Fill us with a light that we can take to a dark world. We surrender ourselves into your hands. We trust you, O God, knowing that you hold each and every one of us in the hollow of your hand. May we resolve to live differently and make a difference. And we ask for the help and the power of the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name.